We need to discuss validation. At the moment, when I create a new project, if I fill out one field and not the other, our application blows up. And that's because we're trying to insert into the database a description of nothing, an empty string. And because we don't allow that, it blows up. It lets you know, hey, there's some kind of integrity constraint violation. Your description cannot be null. So we can handle this in two ways, and I do recommend using both. The first layer is client-side validation. And luckily these days, browsers out of the box provide some pretty useful support. So if we visit the Create view, for the input, I'm just going to add required here. Standard client-side browser validation. So now if we fill out a description but leave the title blank, it won't let me submit the form. And we can do it for both. All right, give it a refresh. I will submit the form. Nope, you got to fill something out. Do it again, and the same is true here. However, we can't depend upon this. I'll show you. Let's say we fill it out, but then the user goes to the title and they remove that required attribute entirely. All right, now they've changed it. Let's leave it blank, submit the form, and we had the exact same issue again. So we can't depend exclusively on browser validation. We need two layers, a front-end side and a back-end side. So let's take care of that. I'm going to go to our projects controller. And it sounds like once we get to the store method, this is after the user submits the form, we need a round of validation before we try to insert that request data into the database. All right, you've already learned about the request helper function. And in fact, we use it here to fetch the title and the description from the post request. However, if we call it as a function, we then get an instance that we can then interact with. And this is where we learned, well, we can just call all to fetch all of the request data. But as it turns out, there's also a validate method. So you can validate the request data. For example, I could say, well, for the request data that you have, the title field, notice that corresponds to this, that is required. You have to give us something. And the description is required as well. All right, so let's just leave it like that, nothing more, and then see what happens. So we'll give this a refresh. I'll submit the project, and the browser validation kicks in. But we're going to disable that. And now try. I'll fill out a description, but no title. We submit the form, and it was very fast, and it looks like it just redirected back to this page. Let's try it one more time. This time we will disable the required field on the text area. I will fill out a title, submit it, and it redirects us back. So this is due to our validation. Behind the scenes, if the validation fails, it redirects back to the previous page and sends through the validation errors. You can access those through an errors variable. Let's put it right down here. Let's set up a notification div here. Say is danger. These are standard Bulma classes, just to give myself a red box. And then within an unordered list, we'll say for each errors, give me all of them as error. And then within a list item, we will spit out that error message. Okay, why don't we try this out? But real quick, let's turn off the required attribute on the text area just for now so that we don't always have to change it from Chrome DevTools. So if we switch back to Chrome and give it a refresh, we still get this box even when there are not errors. Okay, we'll fix that in a moment. But for now, let's add a title, no description, we create the project, the validation failed, it redirected back to this page, and it sent through an errors object that we can now peek into. Here we can see the description field is required. Let's fix that. Submit it again, and we should have our new project. Okay, let's fix this issue though. We don't want to see some big red box if there are no errors. So we can say right here at the bottom, if errors any, remember errors is an object, so there's a number of helper methods on top of it we can use. If we have any errors, only on that condition do I want to build up this notification alert box. Okay, so now if I give it a refresh, we don't see anything. But if we fail validation, we do. Let's add one more. So back to the input, we'll turn that one off as well. Refresh, submit the form, and now we have two validation errors. Now, if you want to get fancy, there are some extra things you can do. For example, I'm using the Bulma CSS framework. I can add classes like this, is danger, and that will give me a red border. And the same, of course, is true for the input. If we want to further point out to the user there's an issue with this, we could do that. So if we want to apply that dynamically, let's come back here and we'll say, for the input, if the errors object has anything for title, then let's spit out is danger, otherwise nothing. We're just using the ternary operator there. So an important thing to understand when it comes to Laravel views is regardless of whether there are validation errors, you will still have access to an errors object. No matter what, you can depend upon that. So that means even if there are not any errors, well, there's still an errors object that you can reference. So here we're saying, is there anything in the errors bag for title? If so, we need to surround that input with a red border. Submit, and there you go. We can do the exact same thing down here. And further, if you want to turn this into like a React component or a Vue component, you can make this stuff much more dynamic as well. For example, you could say as soon as the user types, then remove that red border because they have fixed the validation issue. But we're not going to get that fancy. We submit it, and there we go. But give it a refresh, and they're gone. Now, one issue is you could fill out a title of T and a description of D and still create your project. So these are situations where you have to decide, is that okay? Would there ever be a project with a single letter as the title? And the answer may be no. If that's the case, of course, you can control that through validation. For example, right here, you could say required. Now, we can declare our various validation rules either using a pipe to separate each one or by storing them as an array. The pipe, at least as far back as I can remember, comes from a different framework called CodeIgniter that was very common for that framework, so it got migrated over to Laravel. But of course, you can still use an array. Let's stick with that approach. Let's say required, and the minimum number of characters I expect to see is 3. Okay. Now, if we create a new project, submit it. Nope, the title is required, so we do T and D. Submit it again, and it still fails because the title must be at least 3 characters. So why don't we do the same thing for all of them? A bit arbitrary, but you can find some more real-world uses for your own projects. You could even do things like this, where you say, well, the maximum number of characters I will accept is 255 if you want to fit a MySQL limitation. Now, one quick thing. Did you notice when we submit this form that it redirects back, but it didn't save our old input, so you would have to start all over. And this can often be a little annoying. So why don't we prevent that? If I go back to our view, there's additionally an old helper function. Let me show you how that works. We're going to set the default value of this input equal to the old title. Okay, let's just give that a shot. Refresh, set a title and a description. And now we redirected back, but we retained the old input there. And all that's doing is when the validation fails, Laravel is flashing those attributes to the session, and then we are fetching them. And because things like that are so common across just about all projects, we streamline it as best as possible. So you have access to an old helper function. We can do the same thing here. Old description. Okay, let's do it again. Submit. And now we're retaining what the user typed. Let's fix it. Submit the form, and we're good to go. So as it turns out, there are dozens and dozens of validation rules. Let's research Laravel validation rules. Here we go. And nobody expects you to memorize all of these. You can reach for this section when you need to. So if you want to ensure something is a proper date, or a Boolean, or even if maybe a particular field exists in the database. Or what else? Confirmed. Why don't we do this one together? Confirmed is useful for things like passwords. So have you ever signed up for a site where you enter a password and then they want you to repeat the password? Well, after you do that, there needs to be a validation layer that ensures what you typed into the password field matches what you typed into the second password confirmation field. So again, Laravel has a validation rule called confirmed that you can reach for. And notice it does follow a convention. So if the input is called password, its name attribute is password, then this validation rule is also going to look for a request attribute called password underscore confirmation, and it will make sure that those two match. So it wouldn't be relevant here, but imagine you have a user sign up. You would do something like this. And then also make sure it's required. Required and confirmed. And yeah, there's no point in us going over all of them because you're going to forget. So instead, just rest assured, when you need special validation requirements and rules, you can access those when you're ready. So now to finish up, I just want to show you one last thing. It's a little sad that we have to reference these attributes over and over, title and description, and then we pass it again to project create, title and description. And now imagine in real life when there's 9 different attributes you're validating and 9 different attributes you're passing to project create. So instead, take a look at this. When we validate request data, let's see what that returns. Let's come back, create a new project. Let's make sure it all passes. Well, we get that same array. So when we validate request data, what is returned is the validated attributes, which means there's no point in repeating this. We could just say validated. Or why don't we rename that to attributes, anything you like. Now we've removed just a little bit of repetition. Let's give it another shot, submit it, it fails properly, we pass the validation, and now we have a new project. Let's go ahead and delete that. So we have a full CRUD system for projects working at this point. Finally, if you want to be extra fancy, I think this already looks good, but some people like to even inline it. So they'll say project create like so. And remember, this will work because when you call request validate, if there is an issue, it will automatically redirect, and we will never get to the point of calling project create. So yes, some people will take this approach. Sometimes they'll format it like this. Anyways, that's just a personal preference thing. Honestly, I think what we had earlier looks good, but of course, it's up to you.